Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is the Tang Heng or Tong Heng Dao from Chen. I'm a little dubious on the pronunciation, but I will link in the description down below if you're interested in learning more about it. Before I get into the review, a couple quick caveats. First, it is a review sample. I didn't spend any money on it, and if you think that makes me biased in some way, you know at the start. The next bit you should know, which will be painfully obvious in watching me swing this sword around, is that I do not study Chinese swordsmanship. I do study swordsmanship of a type, but not this type, so my musings and ramblings are that of an enthusiast and not anyone in any position of authority. As you can see, I have pushed the sword to the point of failure. That's usually my shtick, and I tend to do that with review samples that are sent to me. So you can see it's a little bit shorter. The intent of this review is to, more or less show you some glamour shots and hopefully help you determine if the sword is worth your hard-earned money. And I'll tell you my thoughts on how well it held up in comparison to other things that I've broken in my backyard. On that note, the sword is roughly $400 if you include the price of shipping from Chen's website. It may be a little less depending on where you buy it from, if you get it from an authorized distributor or something like that, but it's $330 on their website in this variety. There's a few different steel types that you can get, a few different iterations from folded steel or differentially hardened, and this one that I tested was the through hardened variety, and it retails for $330, but it costs an extra $70 in shipping. As I keep it in the back of my mind, I'm actually going to think about it as a $330 sword because it's not, I don't generally include the price of shipping. It'd be fair to, but I have it in my other reviews. Anyway, $330 is what it costs retail, $400 out the door, and you may be able to get it cheaper. And the other options on there may be more or less expensive, but that's the range I'm thinking of it in my head as I swing it around and do things with it. Anyway, on with the review. All right, so as I do, I will start my review with the end right here and gradually work my way up across the fittings and hopefully get a good view of build quality here. So this cast fitting down here appears to be made of some kind of metal, which you can see I've got my little magnet on a stick here, and the other fittings are also made of some sort of metal. So in the past, Chen has used brass on some of these things. This is a patinaed or painted kind of steel of some sort. Either way, it's magnetic. And the patina actually held up pretty well. So I haven't used this extensively for training or anything. As I noted, I'm not a student of Chinese swordsmanship, but I have swung it around quite a bit, handled it over the last, I think, couple years that I might have even had this sword now. And the patina has actually held up pretty well. It hasn't rubbed off, though I would imagine that would be a concern if you're using this extensively for training, though it's a problem on just about any sword with a type of patina on it. I will note that these little floral pieces that are around the rivet area, there's a rivet that runs through the base of this piece here, this little copper peg that runs through and is smushed down. I can see the hammer marks on it. I do feel this with a bare hand. If my hand goes across this, there are some ledges on here that cause some discomfort. It's something that I've noticed on a few other Chen swords that have this type of piece to it. It may be historical and traditional, but I do find it to rub on my hands a little bit when I hold it barehanded in my hand, dressed down towards the cap area of this piece here. Otherwise, I can notice some imperfections from the casting of this bit. It almost looks like there's and I think Chen makes like a 3D printed mold of something historic and tries to relatively closely recreate the historical fittings. Then they have those cast, and then what I see here is relatively a simple casting, but I do notice some imperfections in the casting. I can make out some seams and some other spots where the casting wasn't exactly perfect. But overall, it's reasonably well done for a simple style of fitting. The end bit down here around the floral pieces, I don't have any issue with my fingers catching on them. There's a little bit of a ledge. I can feel it. It's supposed to be there, and it doesn't cause me any discomfort. Likewise, the ledge where it meets the wooden grip. Now, I would like this to be flush rather than go over the cap. I wish this were more flush and didn't have a pronounced ledge or something like that here. Nevertheless, it does. I don't know how historic it is or isn't, but it's certainly a transition that I can feel on my hand, and I don't necessarily like it, though it's not sharp. The only rough ledges are around these little floral pieces right here where the rivet is. Otherwise, it held up well, and it is worth noting that this did not come off. It did not loosen. I've, again, pushed the sword to the point of failure at this point, and this little end cap here has the slightest bit of wiggle to it, but otherwise doesn't move around or have much of an issue, and it held up all the way through testing. I threw this at trees. I smashed it into a metal pole. I did lots of stuff, and it wouldn't be surprising if this thing loosened at all. That would be par for the course and expected, and held up. So tip of my hat to Chen on the durability side of things here. All right, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the grip, and if you're interested in dimensions or specifications or any of that, there'll be a link in the description down below, or specifications and dimensions in the description down below. I do want to talk about the grip though, and so what you see here is that it's made out of a wood that matches the scabbard relatively closely. Aesthetically, I think it looks pretty good. I will note the only complaint I have about the grip really is that while it's in my dry hand, it really is quite secure, and I can't get it to twist. I feel like I can index it very easily. I feel like it's very secure, and I feel like it gives me some options in how I might want to hold the sword. In practice, with a glove on, which is not helping me much in grip, and in wet conditions, there was snow on the ground and stuff, I put a glove on, my hands were starting to freeze, but I noticed that it would roll in my hand when I was striking the Croquet stake of doom, which you'll see at the end, which pushed the sword to failure. But in those times, I noticed that with a one-handed strike, I really got the sword to kind of roll in my hand, doing some, reasonably hard strikes. But that was an issue. And if that was something that you're concerned about, any type of grip aid would really help here. If you carved in some slots or something like that, anything to help with traction on your hand, because when it's wet and you have a glove on, that's the only time that I noticed that it caused any type of slip. Otherwise, it indexes really well. You can put your hand on it and immediately it tells you how to hold it. It feels really, really comfortable in the hand. That teardrop shape really lets you know how to index the sword, and it's very easy to and very comfortable to hold and know exactly where that edge is at all times. Now, some people grip swords differently. Some people put them in different positions. I tend to have this where it's in line with my knuckles here, and I found that was helpful. I did reasonably well with edge alignment, and I didn't have any problems kind of knowing where the sword was. It's also worth noting that you'll see the grip is together. Now, I'll take this apart towards the end so that I can expose the tang and show you what's there, but I wanted to highlight that it held up all the way through the testing that I put in, and there is some cracks along the seams of where it was glued, and then in some parts there are some spots where the fibers of the wood or whatnot have started to crack and blow apart, and so there is it was put under a lot of stress, but the grip held up well. I didn't notice any shake in the tang. Nothing came back and caused pain for me to swing the sword. Sometimes when the tang is moving around in the sword, it'll come back and kind of pop you in the hand a little bit and cause discomfort. Didn't notice any of that in this case. It held up really, really well. It was very durable all the way through abusive testing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the cross-guarded guard area here. Now, I've seen their shape represented in Japanese-style swords before, but it's not something I'm particularly familiar with. Overall, I think it's very handsome. I like how they blend in. They're made of the same similar steel. I like the transitions and how the gap where it meets the wood, it doesn't have any slots or anything like that where it looks poorly constructed, I suppose I would say. No gaps or anything where the wood meets the grip on this side. The grip as well, it's a handsome shape. There's no sharp ledges, nothing bites in, and it's developed a little bit of rattle, but honestly, I would say that's very minor, all things considered. I put this sword through a lot of torture tests. It was thrown into trees and bashed against metal poles, as I've noted, and it's held up well. There's very little issue with the patina, only a few superficial scratches, and the rattle that it's developed, I would say, is relatively mild considering what's been done to it and how other swords have reacted to similar treatment. So it's held up very well, and it wasn't until really the tail end that it started to develop this kind of little bit of rattle. The gap where it meets the blade collar, this blade collar has also a patina on it, but it covers any kind of gap that I would see. So overall, the construction looks pretty smooth in the gap of the crossguard area here, and I like the way it fits in with this fitting set here. Unfortunately, it doesn't at the moment because the Habaki, which I'll show you, this blade collar has been diminished, but nevertheless, I think overall they fit together in a very, very handsome way and shows some keen eyes to construction over here. I like that there's no gaps. It's really quite pleasant looking around the crossguard area. I'll talk a little bit about this blade collar now. Now, this is a brass blade collar that's got a similar patina on it, and this patina has not held up as well. So it's got some scuffs and scratches on it from just being drawn, and gradual wear in the brass is starting to show through. It hasn't held that kind of blackened color as well as the steel fittings have. It's also notable that it's loosened up quite a bit. Now, this is brass, and there's some flexible steel around it and wood and harder things, so it's not, again, a surprise that this blade collar has loosened or frayed or caused an issue. This would be kind of a maintenance topic. If you put a blade collar on here to absorb some of the shock and it's made of softer metals, well, inevitably it loosens up and requires some fidgeting to get back to functional. But the back has torn off a little bit, and it doesn't sheathe anymore, and it hasn't held the patina as well. So I might argue that putting a copper piece on here or not blackening it so that it, or whatever patina was used to color this habaki or blade collar thing. Habaki is the Japanese term I'm familiar with. I know this is a Chinese sword, but forgive me for my misspeak there. Anyway, I don't think the patina held up particularly well, and it's a little bit of an eyesore, all things considered. I'd like it if it were just brass. The attempt at putting some sort of patina on it is appreciated if the patina holds up. In this case, I don't think it did. I do think that the habaki also has a little bit of a lackluster shape. It looks like a kind of a brass saran wrap in comparison to the other fittings, which have a lot more crisp lines and clean stuff to them. The spine on this is rounded, and there seems to be some tool markings or, I don't know, just fit and finish that isn't as well suited as the rest of the fittings on the sword. So I'm not a big fan of this blade collar thing here. I'd rather maybe there wasn't one, or if there was, that a little bit more attention got paid to it. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the scabbard, and a couple quick bits to note is that these little fittings on here do move around some, except for the one on the end. This one seems very secure and has held up well. The top two pieces do move relatively freely with a little bit of force. This one, if I pull it up, is friction fit. This one, not to the same degree, but I think a little bit of glue would solve the problem, and this was sent to me around the time that LK Chen kind of noted they were having some issues with the adhesive. So since I've had this for well over a year, it's entirely possible that that issue has been completely resolved and you won't have the same type of issue. Otherwise, the build quality of these fittings seems roughly similar to the build quality of the fittings on the sword itself. They're relatively practical and simple looking, but have some nice ledges and detailing on them, and overall I think it's a handsome presentation. Same with this little end cap here. This is a little bit weighty as well, so if you wanted to give somebody a little buff with this sword, this would be an uncomfortable thing to receive if you need to deliver percussive maintenance. The scabbard also has the same kind of teardrop shape, and overall I think it flows really well. It's a very handsome looking scabbard, and I think the overall presentation on the sword, if you like the wood and black and metal look, is overall very appealing. The scabbard also fit together reasonably well. It drew reasonably well. I did some Japanese style cuts where I drew from the scabbard and cut, and it was comfortable. It didn't rattle excessively when the sword was together in one bit. I can't recall honestly if it fell out if I shook it, but I recall the tension being reasonably well done as well. All right, sword fans, I'm going to talk about the blade, the pointy, stabby part, and I'll try to focus first on the blade and its features, and then talk about performance and what I think about that afterwards. But blade was reasonably straight. It had some command of distal taper and whatnot, which LK Chen often does, and you can maybe see that better in the description down below where I've put the measurements. The blade is relatively simple looking, though. It didn't have some of the profiles and tapers and bevels and fullers and the like that you might see on some of the other swords from LK Chen. This one was basically a thicker spine that tapers all the way without any bevel all the way to the edge. And the edge came reasonably sharp as well, is worth noting. Now, pool noodles are a thing that you need to have reasonable edge alignment and a pretty keen edge to pop them apart with some swift strikes, and this one did that. So, while it could be a more refined edge for those of you that are very particular about the sharpness, it was sharp enough to do that task anyway. I could pop the pool noodles apart pretty easily. It was very fun and effortless to cut that type of material with, which I'll talk about in a moment. Anyway, not a lot of bevels, reasonably straight. This one also doesn't have much in the way of looks, in the sense that it's just the mono steel, the through hardened variety that doesn't have a differentially hardened edge on it to pull out or show, and it doesn't have any folding patterns or anything like that. Those options, I believe, are available if you so choose. This, however, was a very good practice tool, so if your intention is cutting, I think this held up really well, and I would certainly encourage you to buy a steel of this type if your intention is to actually use it and potentially push it on some of the medium type of targets. Anyway, the point also has a false edge to it. It wasn't sharp, so I didn't do any cuts with it, but it did aid in some of the pokey stabby stuff that you might want to do with it. And I could have sharpened the false edge. I opted not to. I tested it just out of the box, and you'll see that in the next testing. Anyway, there's not a huge amount to show you in terms of profile or anything like that. You can see some of the subtlety of LK Chen's craftsmanship in the description down below, where I've outlined that there is distal taper, and it brings me to the dynamic features of the sword. I was really loath to break this one because it feels excellent in the hand. Now, I noted that it did turn a little bit in my hand when I was doing some abusive stuff, but this is a light and lively sword that you wouldn't swing at steel poles or try to chop big frozen branches with. So in the dynamics, if you're practicing any type of Chinese swordsmanship and something lively with the weight of a sword is what you're looking for, this is absolutely excellent. It was very fun to move around. Very lively. I felt like I had a reasonable amount of tip control when the tip was still on the sword. I felt like I could be relatively precise with it, but it still had some authority in the cut, and it moved really, really well. It was very comfortable on my hand, and as a training tool was absolutely excellent. It's broken now, but at the time when it was all together, I thought it was a very lively and just a very nice sword. And if you're practicing for single-edged cuts, then, or with a single-edged sword, then this is a worthy contender if you're looking for a practice tool. It doesn't necessarily have much in the way of looks, honestly. Obviously, I like the aesthetics of it. I like the simpleness of it, but with simple blackened fittings and no kind of folding or differential patterns or anything like that, it doesn't have, maybe have some of the features that might draw you to something from a wall hanger or decorative perspective. But from a practice tool or for a fun sword to just cut with, even if you're not particularly familiar with Chinese swords, just the way this moves is really good. And I've noticed that with a lot of LK Chen swords, they tend to feel really, really good in the hand, and that's intentional. They're designing them and trying to build them that way after the historical artifacts, which likely needed to feel good in the hand if you were going to carry them off and potentially stake your life on them. All right, sword friends, I'm going to talk now about the cutting side of things, and there is a caveat here that I should have noted at the beginning. I tested it on a cold day. Cold weather, particularly the type of cold that I'm testing them in, is not great for swords. They tend to be a little bit more brittle in my experience. I don't know the science behind it. I don't know what temperature it has to be before it's scientifically less reliable as steel. I don't know that information, but historically in the swords I've tested, they tend to act a little weirder and be a little bit more brittle or a little more prone to damage than they are when I test them in the summer months. So it's worth pointing that out first and foremost. And the sword held up pretty well. So little spoiler, it held up pretty good for summer months, let alone winter ones. So do bear that stuff in mind. Anyway, swinging the sword around, I cut pool noodles. As I noted, it came sharp enough to cut those pool noodles pretty well straight out of the box. It was really fun to pop the pool noodle apart with it. I really have no complaints about how it worked there. I split logs as well with the with it, but before I did that, actually, I cut some branches, and it's worth noting that the branches that I'm cutting are frozen. They were green earlier in the summer, so they're not like dried up or easy to cut branches. They're frozen. They've been outside a long time. Some of the weather that I'm testing is well below zero. So anyway, bear in mind that they are more like icicles mixed with wood than just the common green branch. And anyway, that's where it took its first set of damage. So in cutting some of the smaller branches that were frozen, when I struck with the sword, I noticed some small glinting along the edge of the blade. Not a huge amount, but it certainly did damage or make a notable little glint or deflection in the edge. As I tested further and harder branches, or thicker branches, if you will, it's from the same tree. It's a cottonwood tree, and they were green again in the beginning of the season. But the thicker branches, at no time did the sword really bend, but gradually it took more glinting and things like that, and there was some edge damage. It's worth noting that the edge damage from branches and stuff like that, well, it's not great. It's not unexpected when I'm cutting into a albeit, green branch, but frozen. And I thought that the edge could be reprofiled or sharpened up to a keen level again by somebody with some even mediocre level of sharpening. So still functional, still could totally be repaired. I did then split some wood with it. It held up well in cutting and splitting some of this wood. It's not particularly hard. It's harder to cut through the green branches, but splitting wood, sometimes it gets stuck in there, and that is a recipe to bend the sword, and it didn't take any sets or bends at all. I did thrust into the wood as well. I'd use it as a pickup stick, if you will, and the tip did take a slight little bit of bend when I was using it to thrust the tip into the dried logs or the wood pieces, which I used later to warm myself up. But the point is, I split some wood, got some starter wood sticks going, and it split it just fine. It didn't dull the edge. I didn't notice any particular issues from doing that, which I wouldn't really expect it to, other than the tip bending a little bit, which is disappointing, but at the same time not crazy. It could be straightened out, and it could be sharpened back up again. And it was only about 2 millimeters of the tip that had a very slight cant, if you were being particular about it. Anyway, after doing the log splitting and the like, I threw the sword at a tree. I cut harder and thicker logs, and I also didn't notice any kind of bends in doing those things to get the sword to bend. And I'm actually skipping backward a little bit. I did see if the sword would bend. I hit it on the flat hard against my stand, right? So it's a 6x6 and it's in the snow. It's not going anywhere. And I have to slap it intentionally hard along the spine to get it to bend several times. And over that course, it did bend a little bit with the spine. I could get it to bend that way. A couple strikes on the reverse side, and I could straighten it back out. So it will take a set, but I had to be pretty aggressive to get it to take a set. Throwing it at a tree, I didn't notice any particular bends, but it did start to bend at the handle a little bit. So I struck it along kind of where the blade meets the handle, and it straightened itself back out. You can see, even now in the video, it's got maybe a slight twist. It's not perfectly straight, but overall it's still pretty straight. And considering that I threw it at a tree several times and then straightened it back out kind of at the hilt area, it's surprising that it was able to have the memory it did and get back to a point of straight. Eventually, then I took it to the Croquet Stake of Doom. The Croquet Stake of Doom is what I use to break swords. I'm expecting it to break. I'm expecting it to take a lot of edge damage. It's a big frozen metal rod, and basically the recipe to break swords is typically strike several times against the edge and then reverse it, and a few strikes usually is enough to break a sword. And in this case, it was not. So I struck several times. It didn't break. It didn't break on the edge, which thin swords like this also... I would be totally okay if this sword broke when I was striking on the Croquet Stake of Doom after a few strikes. It's a relatively thin blade. It's not particularly thick. There's no bevels or anything like that. Basically, I'm expecting it to break a little sooner than it did. I'm kind of impressed it lasted as long as it did. I was kind of thinking it would probably break after maybe 5 or 6 strikes into the Croquet Stake of Doom. Given that it was cold and given it's a pretty thin blade, that's kind of par for the course in what I've seen from other blades of this profile. So the fact that it didn't, and I could strike several times into the Croquet Stake of Doom, and then reverse it, strike several times in the spine, and still have it not break was a bit of a surprise. I then went to go and actually look for another target, but all of them were the other swords that I have around to test on were frozen, and I didn't want to move my camera. I was trying to go in. So I went back to the Croquet Stake of Doom and started smacking it again several times, and that's really where I started to notice it rolling around in my hand. At this point, when I'm trying to break the sword on a metal stake that's moving around, and the sword is glinting off of that, and it's twisting in my hand, and that's really where I started to notice it rolling in my hand more than any other point. Again, several strikes on the front and the back yield nothing, and so I really have to get a two-handed grip and start striking with more authority. I got to be careful here because swords can fly back at me. It's a point where I got to be relatively cautious, and eventually the sword broke. But it took a lot. It took a lot to break the sword. I was expecting it to break well before it did. It held up remarkably well, and I'm really glad to see that. One of the last swords that I tested from LK Chen had a different experience where it broke a little sooner. This, with their through-hardened construction, the way they built this, I would say it exceeded my expectations in how it held up. So overall, thumbs up there. It was also really fun to use. Again, I was loath to break the sword. Aesthetically, it doesn't have the kind of zazz that the Chujian does from LK Chen. I really like the aesthetics of that one and also how it feels. But in terms of the LK Chen swords that I've had of this length, this is one of my favorites. It really felt spectacular in the hand. It was a joy to move, and I'm sorry that it is no longer what it was. Anyway, that's the usage. Hopefully, this information up until this point has been helpful enough to help you make a decision on if the sword is worth it or not. But I'll tell you now, do I personally think it's worth $330? And the short answer for that is yes. Realistically, look at what I complained about. There's some slight discomfort from the floral rivet area on the grip, a little aesthetic issue with the habaki, and then some adhesive on the scabbard. And other than that, it was exactly what I would think a $400-ish sword would be. There's some aesthetic things that maybe you like, you don't, but realistically, dynamically, this sword was just excellent. It moved around, and for a light, lively blade, it was just that. Easy to index, easy to move, point control, some authority in the cut, easy to use with two hands or one. Just a lot of fun to be had with this sword. And even though it's not one that I study or I have a lot of experience with, it certainly just instantly feels like you know what to do with it in your hand, and that's a rare quality with swords, and something that I seem to have with a lot of LK Chen swords. They put a lot of thought in how they should feel, and that's not something that you always get. It is something that you get here, and it seems worth the asking price if that's what they're delivering. Also, it's worth mentioning that the sword is very durable, so if you're looking for a training tool, you can have some faith that this one's going to hold up, especially if you're not bashing it into a metal rod in the middle of winter in your backyard. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully they're helpful. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments down below. Thank you to LK Chen for sending me the review sample. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and that's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.